The modern Gulf looks permanent on a map, as if its borders were shaped by history, geography, or some natural political logic. But much of that certainty is an illusion. The lines separating Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, and Oman are far newer, far less organic, and far more improvised than most people realize. In several of the most important cases, they were not the result of local agreement at all. They were drawn under British supervision, quickly, strategically, and with consequences nobody living there would be allowed to debate. Before outside powers imposed fixed frontiers, the Arabian Peninsula worked by a very different logic. Authority was fluid. Loyalty followed tribes, families, and alliances, not neatly surveyed territory. A ruler's influence reached as far as people recognized it and no farther. In that world, the modern idea of a hard border cutting across open desert would have felt strange, even meaningless, to the people moving through it. Britain saw things differently because Britain needed order on paper. The Gulf mattered to the empire not because of the desert interior, but because of sea power. These waters connected Britain to India, the crown jewel of the empire, and securing that route meant controlling the coast. To do that, Britain needed rulers it could negotiate with, obligations it couldn't force, and territories it could define. Tribal influence had to be translated into something imperial officials could manage. That process began in the early 19th century. After a British naval campaign in 1820, coastal rulers were pressed into a series of agreements. They accepted restrictions on maritime raiding, promised not to deal independently with rival foreign powers, and agreed not to transfer territory without British approval. In return, Britain offered protection. Over time, this arrangement expanded across the coast. Bahrain entered a similar relationship in 1861, Kuwait in 1899, and Qatar in 1916. The Trishul states, which would later become the United Arab Emirates, were gradually pulled into the same system. Each treaty solved one problem for Britain and created another. Once London promised to defend a ruler, it also had to know what exactly it was defending. Where did one ruler's land end and another's begin? For years, that question was postponed because much of the inland desert seemed politically marginal and economically unimportant. Then, the regional picture changed dramatically. The Ottoman Empire collapsed after the First World War. New political entities were being assembled, and the possibility of oil beneath the sands gave previously neglected land enormous strategic value. That urgency set the stage for one of the most consequential border-making episodes in modern Middle Eastern history. In late 1922, British officials gathered local representatives at Caire to settle competing claims involving Iraq, Kuwait, and the expanding domain of Ibn Saud. The negotiations dragged. Everyone wanted more territory than the others were willing to concede. Claims overlapped, tempers rose, and the talk stalled. At that point, British High Commissioner Sir Percy Cox stepped in and effectively ended the argument by imposing a solution. Rather than wait for consensus or undertake any serious local consultation, he decided the boundaries himself. On a map, with startling speed, he marked out the border arrangements that would shape Iraq's southern edge and dramatically reduce Kuwait's size. In practical terms, whole areas changed political ownership because a British official decided they should. The consequences were enormous. Iraq emerged with access to the Gulf, but only in a narrow and deeply limiting way. Its coastline was short, shallow, and poorly suited to becoming the kind of major maritime outlet a larger regional power would want. Kuwait, meanwhile, sat between Iraq and the open sea, controlling territory that Iraq would later insist it needed for strategic and economic survival. This was not a minor technical issue. It planted a grievance directly into the structure of the region. For Iraqi leaders, the problem never really disappeared. From their perspective, Iraq was a state with major ambitions, significant resources, and growing oil interests, but without the coastal depth needed to function freely in the Gulf. Kuwait's position looked less like a neighboring state and more like a barrier. That frustration surfaced repeatedly. Iraqi claims against Kuwait appeared long before Saddam Hussein. Pressure mounted in 1938, again in 1961 when Kuwait became independent, and ultimately in 1990 when Iraq invaded. The invasion had immediate causes, including war debts, disputes over oil production, and accusations involving the Rumaila field. But those were only the triggers. Underneath them sat a much older resentment rooted in the original border design. Iraq's leadership had spent decades arguing that Kuwait's existence in its modern form was artificial, and that the coastal arrangement left by British officials had unfairly boxed Iraq in. The Gulf War did not come from nowhere. It grew from a structural problem built into the map itself. Another long-running dispute emerged between Bahrain and Qatar. Their rivalry over islands and coastal claims lasted for generations and survived the end of formal British rule. Its roots reach back to older struggles for control, but British intervention hardened the ambiguity rather than resolving it. Britain separated Qatar politically from Bahraini influence in the 19th century. Yet key territories between them remained contested. One of the most sensitive issues involved the Hawar Islands, located extremely close to the Qatari coast. In 1939, Britain awarded those islands to Bahrain, but Qatar never accepted the ruling. The disagreement lingered for decades, and at times became dangerous. In 1986, it nearly escalated into open conflict when Qatari forces landed at a disputed site and detained Bahraini workers. The crisis was contained, but the underlying issue remained unsettled until the International Court of Justice delivered a final ruling in 2001. What looked on the surface like a local island dispute was, in reality, another legacy of external boundary making that had never properly matched local realities. The UAE presents a different version of the same story. Before federation, the 7 tritial states were linked by overlapping loyalties, settlements, and territorial claims that did not translate easily into clean borders. When Britain finally tried to sort them out, the task fell in large part to Julian Walker, a British official who spent years traveling the region, speaking to tribal leaders, and piecing together a territorial picture from local testimony. His work was extensive, but even he was dealing with a landscape that did not naturally fit straight administrative lines. The result was a patchwork of boundaries, enclaves, and irregular frontiers that still define the UAE today. Some pieces of one emirate sit inside another. Omani territory is split by UAE land, including the Muzandam Peninsula, whose position gives it immense strategic value at the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz. These arrangements were not the product of some slow, stable historical evolution. They were the outcome of rushed attempts to freeze a fluid political world into permanent geography. And those rough decisions had real consequences after independence. Territorial friction among the Emirates did not simply vanish once the UAE was formed. There were clashes over disputed agricultural land, and local forces had to step in to contain them. The federation endured, but the inherited map remained awkward. Saudi Arabia followed a somewhat different path because its core territory was not assembled by British cartography in the same way. Ibn Saud built his state through conquest, alliance, and military expansion from the center of the peninsula outward. By the time the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was proclaimed in 1932, it was clearly the product of local power, not a colonial invention in the same sense as some of its neighbors. Even so, that does not mean Britain was irrelevant. Saudi Arabia's outer edges, especially to the north, were still shaped under British influence. Britain recognized certain realities, subsidized Ibn Saud at key moments, and most importantly helped define the borders where Saudi expansion collided with British-controlled or British-protected territories, such as Iraq and Kuwait. So while Saudi Arabia won its heartland through force, some of the lines around it were still fixed by outside hands. Oman stands apart in another way. It is not a state created by British design. The Al-Busaid dynasty dates back to the 18th century, and Oman possessed a political identity long before Britain became dominant in the Gulf. At one point, Oman was a maritime power with holdings that stretched deep into East Africa and the Indian Ocean world. Britain dealt with Oman through treaties, but Oman was more partner than protectorate. Its state tradition did not begin with British intervention, even if British power affected its surroundings. Taken together, the Gulf map reveals a striking pattern. Some states were constrained, some were favored, Some were separated almost by administrative convenience, and others inherited strange territorial shapes because outside officials needed fast answers. These borders were not drawn with perfect knowledge, and in many cases, they were not drawn with local legitimacy either. Yet once they were written onto maps and backed by imperial power, they hardened into international reality. What makes that especially important is that the people making those decisions had no idea how much wealth lay beneath the ground. Oil had not yet transformed Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, or Abu Dhabi into energy giants. The lines came first. The oil came later. That meant the political map and the distribution of immense future wealth became locked together almost by accident. Whoever happened to fall on one side of a line inherited one set of resources. Whoever fell on the other inherited another. In time, those distinctions would shape power, security, and survival across the region. That is why these borders still matter so much. They are not just lines between states. They are the framework through which oil fields, ports, islands, shipping lanes, and military vulnerabilities are organized. They help explain why Iraq saw Kuwait the way it did, why Bahrain and Qatar argued for generations, why the UAE inherited such a complicated internal geography, and why strategic choke points in the Gulf remain tied to decisions made under colonial pressure. The modern Gulf was not simply born from ancient identities, rising naturally into statehood. Much of it was fixed in moments of political expediency by officials trying to manage empire, security, and competing claims with incomplete information. A conversation in a desert camp, a line drawn across a map, a ruling made for short-term stability. These choices outlived the empire that produced them and became part of the region's permanent structure.